Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 316, The End of the Tudors. Elizabeth shared the public's excitement over the victories at Cadiz, which further enhanced her reputation in Europe. The Venetians, in fact, were now calling her the quote-unquote Queen of the Seas. But she was more concerned about cost than glory. And when Essex returned, she did not heap praises and thanks on him as he expected, but sourly asked him to account for his expenditure, desiring to know what great profit and gain she was to get on her investment. Essex was forced to admit what she already knew, that there was none. In fact, more money was needed to pay his men. Elizabeth snapped that she had known everyone but herself would make a profit, and reluctantly loaned Essex £2,000 for wages, demanding that he pay it all back. The Queen was also jealous of Essex's success and his obvious popularity with the people. Crowds gathered to cheer him, seemingly wherever and whenever he was in public. Essex was energetically involved in every aspect of state policy and dominated the Privy Council. Meanwhile, Philip declared himself indignant at the sack of Cadiz and resolved to build yet another armada, this one scheduled to attack England in 1597. England certainly did not need to deal with another foreign invasion. It had quite enough on its plate as it was. For a third year in a row, the kingdom was struck by excessive rainfall and the resulting terrible harvest. Elizabeth ordered her government to take any and all actions to alleviate the suffering of the poor, and it did, but they were still dying in the streets by the dozen that winter. In February 1597, Essex told the Queen that they should attempt another preemptive attack on the Spanish fleet before it could set sail against them. She was amenable, but wasn't sure if Essex or Raleigh should lead it. Ultimately, she agreed they would share command. However, the wind intervened. By the time the English fleet set sail in early July, it was driven back by poor winds and rough weather. In August, after the ships had been repaired, Essex set out again. Once again, rough winds prevented the English fleet from reaching where the Spanish armada was anchored. Prior to leaving, Elizabeth had given Essex permission to go after the Spanish treasure fleet, but only after he had destroyed or crippled the armada. Now, he announced the fleet would set sail straight for the Golden Galleons, without even touching the armada, in direct contravention of Elizabeth's order. Essex therefore sailed to the Azores. He arrived on September the 15th, and the treasure fleet was expected at any moment. But now Essex allowed his ships to have become scattered, and they were unable to operate as a concentrated force. Raleigh, on his own initiative, took his ships and sacked a nearby Spanish town, seizing a massive treasure haul, which infuriated the jealous Essex. So Essex then decided to take the island of San Miguel, and he did. But by doing so, he missed the treasure fleet by a mere 3 hours. It was carrying 3.5 million pounds of silver. Had Essex taken it, Philip would have been forced to sue for peace. But he missed it by just a little. Making matters worse, while Essex was out near the Azores, the new armada that he hadn't attacked set sail for England. England flew into a state of high alert. But by the end of October, news filtered in that this second great armada had been badly wounded by the weather. Philip, now extremely sick and bankrupt, determined that there was no path forward. The enterprise of England had ended in failure. On October 26th, Essex reached Plymouth, where he was alarmed to hear that, quote, the Spaniards were upon the coast, end quote. Some galleons had even been sighted nearby. He hastily refitted his ships and sailed to meet the enemy, though it soon became clear that the crisis was past. When he returned to face Elizabeth, the failure of his voyage was notorious, and he had little to offer her beyond a few merchant ships captured on the way home. More seriously, by his critical mistake, it left England dangerously exposed to invasion, and the Queen received him with a cold shoulder. She told Cecil, quote, I will never again let my fleet out of the Channel, end quote. Elizabeth was also angry because Essex's popularity had been in no way diminished by his undutiful behavior. Most people thought he had been plain unlucky, or held Raleigh responsible for the expedition's failure. England's hero, it seemed, could never be guilty of incompetence. Now Essex, for the life of him, could not understand why Elizabeth was upset with him and his actions. He was never good at self-reflection, as an aside. While all this was going on, King Henry IV of France decided to sound out England and France on a permanent peace. France was exhausted from decades of conflict and needed a rest. But Elizabeth heard, erroneously, that Philip was intending to send another armada next spring and refused the talks. She even floated the patently false rumor that Philip was trying to have her assassinated. Robert Cecil firmly wanted peace, but ultimately the French ambassador left, convinced it wasn't possible. By this point, it was early 1598, and it's worth pointing out that many people were already starting to communicate with James VI, assuming he was going to be Elizabeth's successor. Everyone was hoping that once Elizabeth and Philip II died, there might finally be some lasting peace between the two kingdoms. In early 1598, France and Spain signed a treaty, proving it was possible. Moreover, England suddenly had problems much closer to home. News arrived that Elizabeth's Lord Deputy to Ireland had died. She decided to replace him with Essex's uncle, Sir William Knowles. In the midst of all this, William Cecil, 78 years old, fell seriously ill. He died on August the 4th, 1598. For months afterwards, Elizabeth would break down at the mere mention of his name. But death was not only taking the Queen's friends. On September the 13th, Philip II, arguably the greatest monarch in Spanish history, died. He was succeeded by his son, Philip III. Philip III was 20 years old and not nearly as fanatical as his father. He would continue the war against England, but in a half-hearted effort at best. 2 weeks after William Cecil died, serious news arrived from Ireland. An English army had been ambushed and annihilated by the Earl of Tyrone, leaving over 1,200 dead. Tyrone had been loyal to Elizabeth, but turned traitor in 1595. He basically just wanted Elizabeth to leave Ireland to the Irish. He demanded freedom of worship and the withdrawal of English troops. Tyrone, of course, was also supported by Spain. The moment Essex heard of Tyrone's victory, he wrote to the Queen asking for the right to command the English response. She initially declined, but when the men she sent soon died after arriving in Dublin, Elizabeth relented and reluctantly appointed Essex as the new Lord Deputy. Now, Essex had put himself forward again, but everybody knew that she had no choice in the matter. No matter what Elizabeth wanted, the Earl of Essex was going to be the Lord Deputy of Ireland. And basically, all of his inabilities up to this point had convinced Elizabeth that he was going to be terrible and this was going to be a disaster, but there really wasn't anything that she could do about it. So for the next 2 months, Elizabeth and Essex argued over how the campaign should be conducted. He wanted the largest army ever sent to Ireland, and when she refused it, he sulked. He would later write, quote, "How much soever her majesty despiseth me, she shall know she hath lost him who, for her sake, would have thought a danger a sport and death a feast. His honor could not stand without undertaking it." End quote. But in the end, his persistence got him what he wanted: the greatest army ever raised during Elizabeth's reign. Essex would have 16,000 infantry and 13,000 cavalry. He would later tell a comrade, quote, "By God, I will beat Tyrone in the field, for nothing worthy of her majesty's honor has yet been achieved." End quote. Essex was totally dismissive of all the major obstacles ahead of him. The English did not understand the native Irish at all. Guerrilla warfare was the norm in Ireland, and the land well disposed toward it, mostly consisting of bogs and mountains. Eventually, Essex realized he may have bitten off a bit more than he could chew. Reflecting on the position, he wrote he had accepted, quote, "the hardest task that ever a gentleman was set about," end quote. Not sure how hard or true that was, but it was going to be hard for sure. Elizabeth was also having second thoughts. She knew Essex was brave, but she was a lot less sure about his mental stability and even his loyalty. Since a performance of Shakespeare's Richard II in 1597, many of her subjects saw Essex as a new Bolingbroke who would right the ship of state. But given that all the preparations had been made, she had little choice but to let him go. On March the 27th, he marched out of London at the head of his army. On April the 15th, he arrived in Dublin. The goal had been to confront Tyrone immediately. This would have been hard, so Essex changed tact without telling his queen, choosing to ravage the provinces of Leicester and Munster instead. June came, and still Essex did not march against Tyrone, causing Elizabeth to dispatch a furious letter, entreating the Duke to get on with it. Essex decided to move, finally, but only took one small castle before marching his army back to Dublin on the 11th of July. Once again, when Elizabeth got wind of this, she wrote another letter commanding Essex to proceed to Ulster, where Tyrone was based. When the Queen's letter arrived, he was in Leinster again, fruitlessly proceeding against some minor rebels. Even those proved too much for Essex at this time, and in August he had to return to Dublin after suffering a string of defeats. By then, of his 16,000 men, Essex only had 4,000 remaining. Most had deserted or died of disease. Elizabeth was appalled when she got the news, and incredulous at the advice given Essex. Agitated, she sent another 2,000 reinforcements, and on August 10th, told him she expected to hear in his next letter that his offensive against Tyrone, quote, "is begun and not in question," end quote. She angrily charged him on his allegiance not to leave Ireland without her permission until he had, quote unquote, reduced things in the north, and of course, accomplished what he had been sent to do. He had to stop his resources fighting these inferior rebels in the interior. She ended the letter with saying, quote, "We require you to consider whether we have not great cause to think that your purpose is not to end the war," end quote. Now, Essex was pretty ill himself at this point, suffering from a variety of maladies. And for his part, he had become obsessed with the idea that Cecil was undermining him back in London. Hence, he announced, to everyone's astonishment, and in direct contrivance to the Queen's orders, that he intended to cross with his remaining troops to Wales. From there, he would gather more men and march on London, where he would demand that the Queen sack Cecil and remove his entourage from power. While he stressed he meant the Queen no harm, those around Essex begged him to change his mind. This was, after all, treason, plain and simple. To leave Ireland would be to ignore a direct royal command. And to march on London, well, that might spark a civil war. In the end, they convinced Essex to take a smaller number of close associates with him to approach the Queen with his concerns. But not, crucially, they added, until he had dealt with Tyrone, as he had been ordered to do. So at the end of August, Essex finally marched into Ulster. However, at this point, his army was outnumbered 2-1. So when he finally reached Tyrone, he first suggested the two men settle the issue with single combat. Tyrone declined. He was in his 60s, so he was kind of citing his age. But then something else happened. Essex met with Tyrone privately, and what exactly was said has been a matter of some conjectures over the centuries. But it seems Essex's intent, at least, was to bring Tyrone in on his rebellion. Tyrone demanded that Essex leave Ireland and take his men with him. Ultimately, the two agreed on a truce to be renewed every 6 months. To what extent Tyrone offered aid to Essex and what came next remains a matter of debate. One of our problems is that Essex deliberately did not take a witness to the conversation, which would have been typical protocol. Now, that being done, Essex took his army back to Dublin. A week or so later, Elizabeth was told about the meeting that he had with Tyrone, but he was not told about the truce. Essex never received her letter. On the 24th of September, he suddenly announced he was leaving for England and taking a substantial number of followers. Took a ship a half an hour later, in defiance of the Queen's orders and having technically abandoned his entire army. Elizabeth and many other people would interpret this as desertion. In 6 months, he had wasted £300,000 of public funds, and his campaign had been nothing less than an unmitigated disaster. At dawn on the 28th of September, having ridden hard for 3 days, he reached Westminster, where he discovered that the Queen was at Nonsuch. Leaving his escort in the capital, he crossed the Thames by the Lambsmith ferry and galloped south at a great speed in driving rain, arriving there at 10 a.m. the next morning. Then he strode into the palace caked with mud, marched through the presence and privy chambers, and burst, unannounced, into the Queen's bedchamber. Elizabeth had just left her bed, and her maids were about their work. It now took her a long time to put on her various accoutrements, her wig, her fine clothes, her jewels, so that she could face the world looking at her best. When Essex flung open the door and fell to his knees, she was, according to a courtier, quote, newlied up, her hair about her face, end quote, and her wrinkled face unpainted. Despite her shock and embarrassment, she never lost her composure, but offered Essex her hand to kiss and promised a private speech with him. Elizabeth had no idea what was going on outside the palace. She may have well concluded that her fears had become a reality, and that Essex had come at the head of an army to restrain or even depose her. Yet he seemed cordial, and with great presence of mind she dismissed him, promising that they would talk further when they were both more presentable. So in the afternoon, having determined from Cecil that there was no chance of an actual insurrection, Elizabeth re-summoned Essex. But this time, her attitude was very different, calling him to task for his failures in Ireland and the manner of his return. Essex became angry at this and demanded to explain himself to the council, which he did for, and I'm not exaggerating this, 5 hours. After 5 long hours of listening to Essex talk and talk and talk, the council only needed 15 minutes to recommend to the Queen that he be placed under arrest. On the morning of October the 1st, he was confined to the custody of one of his friends. No sooner had such occurred that Essex fell ill. Nobody, not even Cecil, believed Elizabeth would keep her favorite locked up for very long. When the truce with Tyrone expired in October, and he rearmed, Elizabeth's wrath toward Essex only got worse. Even as the council recommended that he be released from custody, she refused. Essentially, the council believed that Essex had been totally incompetent, but not treasonous. Elizabeth remained unsure. On November the 29th, he was found guilty before the Privy Council of mismanaging the Irish War, squandering £300,000 in funds, and making a shameful treaty in the Queen's name. Throughout the weeks of his confinement, Essex's health continued to deteriorate. He was suffering the negative impacts of gout. He wrote repeatedly to the Queen, imploring her that his condition was growing worse by the moment. But she ignored him. Still, the public had not given up on their great hero. The English people rabidly devoured pamphlets defending his name. Near the end of December, Essex's condition rapidly deteriorated and he nearly died. On December 19th, it was in fact rumored that Essex had died, and several church bells tolled in his honor. But a week later, he was sitting up in bed. Another week, and he was once more taking meals at his table. By January, he was well again, but that was not followed with the news of his impending release. Rather, Elizabeth announced that she intended to have him tried for treason, based on his dealings with Tyrone. The trial would take place on the 8th of February. The public continued to be indignant at Essex's continuing imprisonment, many believing because he had not been brought to trial because there was, quote, want of matter to proceed against him, end quote. To counteract this, on the 5th of June, Elizabeth had him brought before a commission of 18 councillors presided over by the Lord Keeper. An invited audience of 200 persons was present. This wasn't a formal court, but a tribunal invested with the power to mete out a punishment agreed beforehand by the Queen, who had devised the whole charade. Afterwards, many courtiers began to believe that she was paving the way for a reconciliation and might forget about the trial. These proceedings lasted 11 hours. The prisoner, who understood very well what was required of him, was made to kneel before the board at which the lords sat. There, they read out a list of his delinquencies, including gross contempt and disobedience, though even from the proceedings they made it clear that his loyalty to the Queen was not in doubt. Then 4 lawyers for the Crown condemned his misdemeanors. Essex was astonished and hurt to see his friend Francis Bacon amongst them. Bacon had in fact begged the Queen not to be present, but she had insisted on his being there. Now, thanks to the intervention of Archbishop Whitgift, Essex was eventually permitted to lean on a chair back as time wore on to sit, otherwise he had to kneel the whole time. After several long hours of accusations, it was time for him publicly to apologize for all his misdeeds and throw himself on the Queen's mercy. But at this point, the Attorney General took it on himself to deliver a lengthy and extremely personal attack on Essex, provoking the Earl to retaliate in kind. This dignified hearing quickly deteriorated into a mudslinging match, and only when Robert Cecil intervened did everyone stop. Finally, Essex, in a moving speech, acknowledged he had been wrong and expressed his deep remorse for offending the Queen. He cried out, quote, "I would tear the heart out of my breast if ever a disloyal thought entered it." So the commissioners found Essex guilty on all accounts. And he was informed that had this been a normal court, he'd be condemned to a huge fine and imprisonment in the Tower for life. But since it was not, and since he abjectly admitted his faults and begged his mercy, he could go home and await the final judgment of the Queen. In the end, Elizabeth ordered that he be dismissed from the Privy Council and deprived of his officers of Earl Marcher and Master of the Ordnance, allowing him to retain only the title that he got from his father, Master of Horse. She considered releasing Essex, but both Cecil and Raleigh warned her that he was almost certainly to start scheming again. So upon hearing this, she just kept him in prison, frankly, mostly for his own good. 3 weeks later, the Queen decided to strip all those knighted by Essex of their knighthoods, sparking what was a terrible fuss for those speaking royal foils. That summer saw the 7th bad harvest in a row. For some time now, the Queen had been preoccupied with trying to solve her country's economic problems. Famine had given rise to widespread discontent and disorder, and there were angry rumblings about the dragging out of this costly war with Spain, which had curtailed so much of England's trade. No longer could Elizabeth live within her means. Instead, she was forced to sell off Crown lands, jewels, and even Henry VIII's Great Seal to pay her debts. Many of her courtiers relied on monopolies and commodities and goods to survive. But the abuse of that system led to bitter complaints from Parliament. On August 29th, on Francis Bacon's advice, the Queen finally set Essex at liberty. But he was banned from holding office and was expected to, by all, quickly retire to the country. He did. For a moment, at least. So, Essex was entirely dependent for his income and his lifestyle on a royal monopoly he had been granted on sweet wines and was desperate to have it renewed. It was, by now, his only financial lifeline. Late in October, Elizabeth announced the monopoly would now be held by the Crown directly. This, plus months of ill health and I'm sure tons of stress, finally broke him. From now on, driven by his clever personal secretary, Essex was in covert rebellion. He began to gather around him all the various disaffected nobles from the realm. Together they met and they plotted. At one point, the plan was to take Elizabeth captive and essentially rule through her. Cecil was aware of all these meetings. He simply kept on the pulse of matters and waited until Essex had woven enough rope to hang himself. In November, the Dutch revolt ended with an Anglo-Dutch victory over the Spanish. Elizabeth, and just about everyone else, now only wanted some kind of honorable peace with Spain. At Christmas, Essex wrote to James VI trying to enlist his support. James was willing to go along with the coup if it succeeded, but he would not lift a finger to help the Duke. During the early weeks of 1601, Essex planned his coup, which was to take place in March. Basically, the conspirators would secure London and the Tower. They would force Elizabeth to summon a parliament, and there Essex could be declared Lord Protector. Of course, Cecil, Raleigh, and the rest would be clapped in irons. A sense of urgency deepened when, on the morning of the 7th of February, a message arrived from the Queen to demand that Essex present himself before the Privy Council immediately. His friends warned him not to go, as he would be arrested, and urged him to act without delay. He briefly considered fleeing, but could not bring himself to abandon his hopes of glory, nor his public, for he was certain the people would rise on his behalf. He therefore dispatched the royal messenger with a message that he was, quote, in bed and all in a sweat, end quote, after playing tennis, and could not attend the council. Then he summoned 300 of his followers and told them that, since he had just discovered that Cecil Raleigh were planning his assassination, the rising would take place tomorrow. The Queen, he insisted, must not be harmed. Late in that day, in order to rouse the population of London, Essex's friend paid a reluctant William Shakespeare and his company of actors, the Lord Chamberlain's men, 40 shillings to stage a production of the inflammatory Richard II. Cecil was also preparing for a confrontation. He summoned levies from the nearby communities, instructed the London preachers to tell the citizens to remain indoors tomorrow morning, and arranged for the guard to be doubled at Whitehall. On the next day, the 8th, he staged his coup. As Essex gathered his friends and supporters and 200 soldiers in the courtyard of Essex House, there was so much noise and commotion that the Queen, hearing of it, sent the Lord Keeper to find out the cause of it and insist that Essex come and explain himself to the council. Essex invited these comers into his library, but the crowd swarmed up the stairs behind them, crying, "Kill them! Kill them!" Essex refused that particular demand and instead locked the 4 men in the library and left with his now very much unruly mob for the city on foot. Wearing his normal clothes rather than armor to signify his peaceful intent, and carrying just a sword, he marched through Temple Bar into Fleet Street, crying aloud, "For the Queen! For the Queen! The crown of England is sold to the Spaniard. A plot is laid for my life." But Essex once again had overestimated his popularity and credibility. Far from flocking to his side, the astonished citizens of London remained tightly indoors, and actually even tried, though unsuccessfully, to prevent him from forcing his way through Ludgate, which had been locked against his coming. By the time Essex reached St. Paul's Cathedral, he was forced to face the fact that there would be no popular uprising. As he turned into Cheapside, his face was, quote, almost molten with sweat, end quote, and the sense of fear was palpable. When he reached the house of the Sheriff of London, who had offered his support, he was perspiring so much he asked for a clean shirt. But already his followers were deserting him in droves, covering their faces with their cloaks, and now the sheriff, regretting having ever gotten involved in such a scheme, escaped out the back door to summon the mayor, who was busy obeying the Queen's injunctions to summon the citizens to arms. Realizing that all was lost, around 2 p.m., Essex fled to his house. He surrendered at 10 in the evening. Throughout the rebellion, Elizabeth, now a veteran to such emergencies, remained cool, calm, and collected. She never doubted her people's loyalty. Elizabeth wanted the chief offenders brought to trial without delay. The council began examining them, uncovering the full details of the doomed plot. On February 13th in the Star Chamber, these were all made public. 4 days later, indictments against Essex, Southampton, and many others were laid bare, and it was decided that the 2 principal offenders should be tried in 2 days. Bacon was one of those chosen to act for the crown, and now he had no qualms about doing so. Though some information had been uncovered about James VI and his support of Essex's idea, at least, the Queen decided to overlook it. Elizabeth's resolve to make an end of Essex was strengthened on the 12th of February, when one of his followers, a certain Captain Lee, who had served as his messenger to Tyrone, and in 1595 had presented Elizabeth with the severed head of an Irish rebel, much to her disgust, was arrested in the palace kitchen on his way to the chamber where she was eating with her ladies. Evidently, Captain Lee's intention was to force the Queen at knife point to issue a warrant for Essex's release. He was tried at Newgate on February 14th and hanged the following day. On February the 19th, Essex was tried by his peers. The verdict a foregone conclusion. Essex was sentenced to be drawn and quartered, but given his stature, as was normal in such cases, the sentence was commuted to beheading. Most people at court believed that if Essex only begged for his life, the Queen would relent and let him live in the Tower for the balance of his days. But he would not. The day after the trial, Elizabeth signed his death warrant. The signature is firm and straight. Her decision final. You can still see the warrant in the British Museum today. The Queen, however, did grant Essex's request for a private execution. On February 24th, Elizabeth watched a performance of one of Shakespeare's plays. Immediately afterward, she wrote to the warden of the Tower to proceed with the execution the following day. There's an old legend that often gets repeated that Elizabeth had once, in better times, given Essex a ring, saying that if he was ever in trouble, he was to send it to her and she would help him. A gold ring with a sardonyx cameo of the Queen, said to be this one, is in the Chapter House Museum in Westminster Abbey. In the 17th century, it was claimed that while he was in the Tower, Essex leaned out of his window and entrusted the ring to a boy, telling him to take it to Lady Scrope and ask her to give it to the Queen. However, the boy mistakenly gave it to Lady Scrope's sister, who was the wife of Essex's rival. And she, out of malice, kept the ring to herself. The story goes on to say that she only revealed its existence to the Queen when she herself was on her deathbed in 1603. Whereupon Elizabeth is said to have told her, quote, "May God forgive you, madam, but I never can," end quote. Now, the story is a complete fabrication. I want to stress that. It was first referred to only in 1620 in a book called The Devil's Law Case, and was later recounted in detail in another story titled The Secret History of the Most Renowned Queen Elizabeth and the Earl of Essex by a Person of Quality. This work of fiction, with a terrible title, wasn't published until 1695. Elizabeth's most believable, I would say, biographer of the time, knew of the story and dismissed it immediately as false. Essex was brought to the scaffold just after 9 a.m. on the 25th of February. His last words were as follows, quote, "My sins are more in number than the hairs on my head. I have bestowed my youth in wantonness, lust, and uncleanness. I have been puffed up with pride, vanity, and love of this wicked world's pleasures. For all which I humbly beseech my Savior Christ to be a mediator to the eternal majesty for my pardon, especially for this, my last sin, this great, this bloody, this crying, this infectious sin, whereby so many for love of me have been drawn to offend God, to offend their sovereign, to offend the world. I beseech God to forgive it us, and to forgive it me, most wretched of all." It took 3 slashes for the swordsman to separate his head from his shoulders. But given the records, it appears he died on the first blow. Essex's passing was mourned by many of the common people, who commemorated his deeds in popular ballads, such as Essex's Last Good Night and Sweet England's Pride is Gone. But the Queen, who had sent him to his death, grieved for him on a more personal level. But there was no doubt in her mind, and frankly, no doubt in anyone's mind, including mine, that he had deserved it, and that England was a more stable and secure state without him. With Essex dead, Robert Cecil was the most powerful man in England. People did blame him for Essex's death, however. Quickly after the execution, Cecil started writing more directly to James VI. He knew Elizabeth would never name a successor, but Cecil told James that if he kept Cecil on, then he, Robert Cecil, would smooth James's path to the crown. After Essex's death, Elizabeth was a different person. The past 2 years had taken a massive toll on her. She was now sad and depressed, and told the French ambassador that there was nothing left that gave her enjoyment. When the 13th and last Parliament of Elizabeth's reign met, it was too in a bad mood. Economics had not been kind to Elizabeth in England of late. Parliament hated the royal monopolies and wanted them gone. It made sense. These monopolies were essentially royal orders, allowing the holder to charge whatever they wanted for said goods. It was a license to charge more for a lesser product. Not exactly capitalism. When Parliament met, there were not even very many calls of "God save the Queen," the traditional greeting as Elizabeth entered the chamber. To add to the problems of famine, the population of England had increased considerably during Elizabeth's reign. The practice of enclosing common land only added to the numbers of the destitute and dying, who would have once been cared for by monks and nuns, but the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s had dispossessed many in the religious life, placing this added burden on local communities and on the state. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, beggars had become a serious problem. In 1598, Parliament passed the famous Poor Law Act, which was published in November 1601, consigning beggars to care for their native parishes, who they were bound by law to provide relief for them. Each city or corporate town was to have its own poorhouse, later known as the workhouse, and the system was to be paid for by local taxation. The Commons, determined to end the abuse of monopolies, were resolved to block a subsidy bill until the Queen had agreed to the passing of an act limiting her powers to grant them. Before they could do so, and in order to avoid a dispute over the royal prerogative, Elizabeth issued a proclamation announcing that she was going to put an end to the present system immediately. There was a jubilant response to this in the House, with members weeping with emotion and fervently shouting "Amen." Parliament decided to send a deputation to the Queen to express her subjects' deepest gratitude and joy. When it came to choosing which members of Parliament were to go, there were cries of all, prompting Elizabeth to send word that although the space was limited, she would be pleased to see them all. In the end, 150 members accepted her invitation. On the 30th of November, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, received them enthroned in the council chamber at Whitehall, where she proved that her old magic could still have its effect. She made what has been said in history to be her golden speech, and was honestly, in so many ways, her farewell address to her people. The Queen was determined to have her say, and she began by saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, we perceive your coming is present thanks unto us. Know that I accept them with no less joy than your loves can have desired to offer such a present. I do assure you, there is no prince that loves his subjects better. There is no jewel, be it never so rich a price, which I set before this jewel, I mean your love. For I do more esteem it than any treasure or riches. For those we know how to prize, what loyalty, love, and thanks. I account them invaluable, and though God hath raised me high, yet this I account for the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. This makes me that I do so much rejoice that God hath made me to be a queen, as to be a queen over so thankful a people, and by means, under God, to conserve you in safety and preserve you from danger." Bidding them to rise, she had more to say to them. She thanked them for making them aware of her people's resentment of the system of monopolies. She assured them that she did not, quote, "desire to live longer days than that I may see your prosperity, and that is my only desire. As queen, yet did I never put my pen to any grant, but that upon pretext or semblance made unto me that it was both good and beneficial to the subjects in general, though a private profit to some of my ancient servants who deserved well. I was never so much enticed with the glorious name of a king, or the royal authority of a queen, as delighted that God hath made me his instrument to maintain his truth and glory, and to defend his kingdom from peril, dishonor, tyranny, and oppression. I speak it to give God the praise as a testimony before you, and not to attribute anything to myself. For I, O Lord, what am I? Oh, what can I do that I should speak of glory? God forbid. Her speech, it was almost unanimously agreed immediately, could not have been better. One member of Parliament said it was worthy of having been written in gold. Moreover, her magnanimous and prompt assent to Parliament's wishes restored her flagging popularity and enshrined her in her people's affections more than ever before. In the end, when it came to voting her a subsidy, the Commons voted an unprecedented quadruple subsidy without a single dissenting voice. When Elizabeth dissolved Parliament on the 19th of December, the Speaker reminded the Lords and Commons that England, alone in Europe, had known a stable government throughout the Queen's reign, and he thanked her on their behalf for, quote, the happy and quiet and most sweet and comfortable peace we have long enjoyed. Blessed be God, and your majesty do still enjoy, end quote. It was a quiet Christmas, though there were plenty of plays and other entertainments. Not that there wasn't cause for celebration. On December the 24th, the English finally crushed the Earl of Tyrone in Ireland. On January the 2nd, 1602, the Spanish who had been supporting the Irish surrendered and sailed for home. England was once more in command of Ireland. It will be for the next 318 years. In June, the English captured a major Spanish treasure ship. That was to prove to be the last maritime adventure of the Queen's reign. Then, of course, there was another major smallpox epidemic in 1602, because there has to be. In September, Elizabeth celebrated her 69th birthday. Yet, there were signs that she was fading. Cecil now had to read her letters. No longer could she recall what post she had appointed different men to. Although Elizabeth had refused to name her successor, speculation on the matter had increased as she had grown older. Most people wanted James of Scotland because he was a Protestant and a married man with 2 sons. Despite their affection for and admiration of Elizabeth, few members of the nobility and gentry wanted another female sovereign. The feeling still persisted that it was shameful for men to be subject to a woman's rule. It was also feared that, quote, we shall never enjoy another queen like this, end quote. As for the claims of the Infanta Isabella, or any other European descendants of old John of Gaunt, such as the Dukes of Braganza and Parma, no one in England took them seriously. Nor was Philip III sufficiently interested to pursue those claims. Of the English claimants, most people discounted the claims of Catherine the Grey's sons as well, whose legitimacy was questionable, and nor were they interested in Arabella Stuart, mainly because, again, they didn't want another queen. Cecil knew at this point it was basically all but certain that Elizabeth was going to die without naming an heir. So it would fall to him to ensure that James VI succeeded to the throne. He had already told James to be ready, and now he stationed horses to be prepared on the northern road to get the news to Edinburgh the moment that the Queen died. On March the 18th, 1603, Elizabeth's health deteriorated alarmingly. Cecil wrote to James the next day that the Queen would likely not make it another 3 days hence. He was right. On March the 21st, 1603, around 10 o'clock that evening, with heavy rain pattering against the windows, Elizabeth turned to face the wall and fell into a deep sleep, from which she would never wake. Her doctor was present, as were her old friends, Lady Warwick and Lady Scrope. And from there she passed into eternal rest, quote, mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree, shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, on Thursday, the 24th of March, 1603. One wrote as follows, and I just cannot get past this line because I think it takes so much of what we think about when we think about Queen Elizabeth, that she passed, quote, as the most resplendent sun setteth at last in a western cloud, end quote. On April the 28th, more than a month after she died, Elizabeth was finally taken in process to Westminster Abbey. Thousands lined the streets. The Queen was buried in the Henry VII chapel above her sister Mary. Then the officers of court broke their ceremonial white staves and tossed them down upon the coffin, officially ending their allegiance to the old Queen. The vault was then sealed. For 45 years, Elizabeth had given her country peace and stable government. During that time, England had risen from an impoverished nation to become one of the greatest powers in Europe. Bolstered by the fame of England's seamen, its navy was now respected and feared on the high seas. The Queen had also brought unity to her people by effecting a religious compromise that lasts until this day, and making herself an enduring focus of their loyalty. Of course, there had been some failures. She had striven throughout her reign to live within her means, but toward the end, even she had been defeated by economic forces that few understood. When she died, England was £400,000 in debt. Ireland wasn't quite fully subdued. Calais, despite her efforts, was still in French hands. And England, so far, had not successfully created a permanent colony in the New World, though it was coming. That being said, none of these issues were particularly Elizabeth's fault. All of her contemporaries bore consistent witness to her abilities. Cecil would later write, "Our blessed Queen was more than a man, and in truth something less than a woman. I wish I waited now in her presence chamber with ease at my foot and rest in my bed," end quote. Life under James I of England, as we'll find out, wasn't going to be as easy as Robert Cecil thought it was going to be. And it wasn't until many years later, honestly, until even English contemporaries came to realize what they had lost. Later on, the Bishop of Gloucester would write, "When we had the experience of a Scottish government, the Queen did seem to revive. Then was her memory much magnified, such ringing of bells, such public joy, such sermons in commemoration of her. The picture of her tomb painted in many churches, and in effect more solemnity and joy in memory of her coronation than was for the coming of King James." I think the most fitting epithet to this unbelievable woman, this unbelievable leader, is to be found in the pages of her official biography. Reads as follows: "No oblivion shall ever bury the glory of her name, for her happy and renowned memory still liveth and shall forever in the minds of men." And I think it does. Now, next week, we turn back to France as Henry IV fights for his throne. If you're interested in supporting the show, there's a link in the show notes that will get you a free trial of Western Civ 2.0. You can get ad-free and early versions of this feed, plus a sort of redo feed where we go back through all the early classical periods of history, but with much, much greater detail.